Okay, as you can now see, both Bruno and Christopher has joined us for the live Q&A, and already we're seeing a lot of questions come through. But if you haven't submitted a question on the back of those presentations, then do use the Q&A box, and I'll try and get through some of them as the discussion unfolds. But yes, I'm going to jump straight in. Firstly, welcome Bruno, welcome Christopher to the event. Good to see you guys.
Thank you.
Great to be here. Thanks, Liam.
My pleasure, and it's great to have you both join us. And like I say, we've got a number of questions on the back of the presentation, so we're going to jump straight in. And Bruno, I'm going to come to you first on a couple of questions. And you highlight new plastic in the presentation, and you shared insights into that. But I suppose the question I have: are there limitations to that? In terms of what plastics it can replace?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And certainly, new plastic is addressable to most mainstream plastics, so polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene. It's not addressable for PET, for the polyester bottles. So it's safe to say we cover more than, let's say, half of the mainstream plastics available, and that's the versatility of new plastic is surprising, right? Because it's one plant-based material that can really help many other plastics become more sustainable. I think one of the touches that you saw is that we are not intending to replace the other plastics or compete with them, but we are really intending to partner to address some of the limitations that they have, right? Most importantly, the environmental persistency. So when you look at the very thin plastics that unfortunately tend to get leaked, like a potato wrap or those very thin packagings, for most of them we are addressable, and we would be able to help them be less persistent.
Okay, thank you. And I know there can be some confusion over the environmental impact of biodegradable plastics, in particular around the process to break them down. So what work is afoot there to address these environmental risks, and also on the education of customers on this work as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was my question when I joined Biologiq, right? Because we talk about plastics are great because they are durable and they are in the shelf for years if needed. But then the problem is if they leak to the environment, they are also very durable. So the first really concern of Biologiq was to understand the mechanism. When did plastics with new plastic would become less persistent? And what we learned is that abiotically, so in an environment without bugs, it remains stable. It's like a little bit like paper, right? Paper is in the shelf. It's going to be there forever, unless it reaches an environment that is biologically active. Those environments tend to be when it leaked. So the mechanisms we are finding out is that when a polyethylene, for example, that is very persistent, leaks to the environment with new plastic, is that first of all, it's going to receive a biofilm. So the bugs start to inhabit that surface like they would do in a normal plastic. And now they are going to start to consume it from the outside in. So we don't see a mechanism of fragmenting, breaking down, not necessarily. What really happens is what we understand is happening, because this is an evolving science, is that they recognize it as something like wood. It's not as easy to eat as paper, but they are able to consume it, and they are going to go from the outside in. And the relevance for us to be in this event is really to start talking about this new possibility that you have durable plastics that are also going to be less durable in an environment of leakage. And this is not a black and white. It's hard to call it biodegradable, for example, right? I mean, then you have the expectation that I'm going to throw this away and it's going to disappear. No, it's less persistent. What we believe with our technology is that we can really aspire for a plastic, for the mainstream plastics, not only, as I think the Goodyear chat was talking about, not only a niche product, but to make all plastics remain as good as they are, as affordable as they are, and as useful as they are, because they are not going to start falling apart. They are not going to become something else, but also less damaging if it leaks in the environment. So we can make probably a 30-day conversation out of the mechanisms, and we are happy to share with engaged parties because we are in the process of discovery. And what we know so far, it's a breakthrough, and we would love to get it tested in society as soon as possible and as broadly as possible so that we can learn and harvest this benefit.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you. And Christopher, I'd like to bring you in now. And in your presentation, you talked to the digital first shift that we've seen unfold this year, and encouragingly in your presentation, you highlight the digital divide that's being exacerbated as a consequence. So what work is HPE doing to help bridge this digital divide? And I want to bring in a question that's one of the audience members has asked. And have you got any localized US examples to share with them?
Yeah, there are a couple. And I think, Liam, thanks for the question, first of all. And it's all very much sort of connected to this broader concept of circularity and shifting new business models. So one of the things that we're really seeing is that as we move and reduce over provisioning, as we're shifting to as a service models, we're building up the capabilities through supplier responsibility to handle end of life assets. HPE, as part of our core business strategy, has actually offered credit in leasing. Well, a couple of decades ago, when we were offered credit in leasing, one of the things that we recognized was we were going to need to have the capability to actually deal with and handle these returned assets. While our business model is primarily focused on enterprise-based assets such as server, storage, networking, we also have the capability to refurbish and remarket laptop or personal-based systems. So one of the things we've been focused on is really looking at the life cycle of assets, both personal systems and enterprise-based assets. Your typical laptop, for instance, while it has high useful life for the first couple of years in an enterprise-type environment, might have a second life somewhere in Eastern Europe and a third life perhaps in Latin America or Africa. So one of the things we focused on doing is targeting places where we could increase levels of digital inclusion through the utilization of these assets that might normally end up in a scrap heap, thereby providing them to young folks that may need them. We have a program through an organization called Boys Hope, Girls Hope, which is in Latin America, where we actually have distributed these sort of third generation laptops after running them through our refurbishment process and getting them into the hands of those young folks so they can actually maintain connectivity to the educational system during the pandemic.
Thank you. And Christopher, another point within your presentation, you talked to, I suppose the transformation that's afoot within HPE. And, I understand that in many products, 80% of the product environmental impact is influenced at the design stage. And as you undergo, I suppose, a shift in approach and potential transactional models of the business, what work is afoot there, in the design stage to put environmental impacts, innovations at the center of the change that you guys are undergoing?
Yeah, it's a great point, Liam. And I think, what we're doing is we're really viewing this across the entire life cycle. You certainly cannot ignore the importance of design. And as we're pivoting to as a service, this connects to your earlier question around refurbishment and these technology renewal centers. So HPE has two of the largest technology renewal centers in the world. But as we're pivoting to as a service and shifting to a different chain of custody model and supplier responsibility, we need to make sure that these products are designed for refurbishment and recyclability, disassembly. So heavy focus on the design phase so that we know when we get these flows of products back into our technology renewal centers that they're easily disassembled down to the component level, reconfigured, life is extended, and they're placed into the hands of a new customer.
Thank you. And I'm just looking at a couple of questions. We've got a number of questions from the audience, and I want to bring one. Maybe I could try and bridge this to both of you. And I'll ask yourself first, Christopher, and I'll come to you, Bruno, afterwards. These technologies, these innovations that are are you working to support developing countries, especially at a time like now when the effect of the pandemic, I suppose, are being amplified or felt maybe potentially worse in some of these countries? How are you assisting in the adoption of these new innovations and technologies that you guys are rolling out? So, Christopher, I'll come to you first, and then Bruno, I'll come to the same question afterwards.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. I think very much connected to sort of these two other points that we've been talking about. One of the things that we've done is we've freed up some credit for some of these organizations, whether it's governments, nonprofits, or for-profit organizations. But simply completely rethinking traditional business models and moving away from a standard CapEx model has really allowed the elasticity for these organizations to spin up during the time of the pandemic, where capital is of paramount concern. So typically companies are provisioning their IT infrastructure maybe 4 years out for sort of peak loads in time. This pivot to as a service allows them to actually only pay for what they use and spin up or spin down with some real-time metering and monitoring so that we can actually match the infrastructure to exactly what their needs are, and then free up the capabilities of folks that are traditionally managing IT infrastructure to do things like innovate and meet the needs of their customers.
Thank you, Christopher. And same question to yourself, Bruno. Around, how are you supporting these and helping roll out these innovations in some of the developing countries that I suppose are in your sphere of influence?
Yeah, Leon, that's a very good point, because if you look at plastics leakage to the environment, it takes place in most of the developing world, right, that don't have waste management systems. So indeed, for no plastic to really deliver its value, it has to reach the markets where environmental leakage is more probable. So no plastic is a very real world application in that it's not making the cost of the solution double or triple. It's very, it's in the overall cost to use of the normal mainstream plastics. And the other interesting thing is that no plastic can be produced locally. So of course we are today only in the US and in China, but as the technology scales up, we can be in Southeast Asia, we can be in Africa, producing new plastic and using it locally. So even generating jobs as we produce locally. So new plastic is very scalable, and it's not an exotic plastic in that it has to cost 2 or 3 times in use. It's and that's why we think we can really get to the mainstream markets and really make a difference as a very small startup that we are, but really make a difference in the overall plastics persistency in the environment.
Thank you. And I'm conscious we've got a couple of minutes left, and I want to bring in a question I had for myself, and a question to both of you again, and I suppose 1 minute from both of you, please. On one of the positives during the pandemic, from my perspective, was the launch of the European Green Deal. And I know this is a US broadcast event, but the European Green Deal will influence a number of both yourselves and a number of our listeners. So within the European Green Deal, there's the Circular Economy Action Plan. Part of it, I suppose in a nutshell, make sustainable product the norm, focusing on electronics, ICT, and I suppose they want to lead the global efforts on circular economy. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on the plan, and secondly, whether it's caused any changes within your own business in terms of investments or potential scaled collaborations you're looking at. So Bruno, I'll come to you first, and then Christopher, the same question yourself afterwards.
Thank you. That's a great one to close our conversation, because one concern we have is that circularity is simplified as recycling. Oh, and yes, circularity will mean that everything is recyclable, but we have to realize that in the real world, there will be the role for recycling, many types, mechanical recycling, chemical recycling, and Biologiq is investing in chemical recycling, but also there will be environmental leakage. So it's not enough to just, let's optimize things for circularity, and forgetting that materials will continue to leak to the environment. So a very recent study shows that at best 5 million tons of plastics will leak to the environment. So yes, we have to take a look at circularity and recycling, but also not forgetting that leakage sourcing. So one of the aspirations we have is that the focus on circularity, that is amazing, doesn't take the other efforts and just make, okay, if I reach recyclable packaging or recyclable plastics, I'm good. But yes, the main problem today is not plastics that are not recycled. Maybe they go to a landfill, that's good enough. The problem is really the ones that is going to the environment. So really, we are talking to the companies to be aware of looking at circularity from the broad perspective and not just recycling.
Thank you. And Christopher?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect segue from Bruno, in that, when we think about circularity, we definitely don't just think about recycling. When we're looking at, in our case, enterprise-based IT assets. And I was actually, I found myself having a couple of great conversations with some of the folks in Brussels and the EU actually working on the Circular Economy Action Plan just pre-pandemic. And one of the things we really talked about was this concept and understanding of full life cycle impacts. Like in the case of an enterprise IT asset, it might surprise the audience to know, we've actually analyzed 1,200 different environmental flows across the entire life cycle. So when I talk about 1,200 environmental flows, I mean particulate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, impact to air, impact to soil, impact to groundwater, on and on, literally down to over 1,000 of these line items. And when you analyze across the complete life cycle of something like a server asset, for instance, which powers the typical data center environment, there's a heavy focus on this concept of end of life, end of use recycling, as Bruno mentioned. Our analysis shows that less than 0.1% of the life cycle impacts of your typical server is tied up in the end of life. So, and most of that impact is actually related to the disposition and particulate and fuel emissions that the trucks emit in taking that server or that asset to the final scrap heap, right? So really sort of rethinking and pulling emotion out of it and being extremely data-driven and data-focused. Now, where are most of the impacts? Most of the impacts are actually in the use phase. So when we're going to spend the next R&D dollar, it really should be focused on improving energy efficiency. And although it's less tangible, it's more important and more material if you're looking at total life cycle impact. So a long roundabout way, Liam, of answering the question, that it needs to be really rooted in pure data and in science and understanding the full life cycle of your products, whether it's a plastic water bottle, whether it's a washing machine, or whether it's a car or an enterprise class server. Understand where the impacts are so that you can find those hotspots and focus on hotspots to improve circularity within your particular product.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And you mentioned something there I really picked up on, is remove the emotion aspect and look at, really look at the facts, look at the data. And that's, I think, critical as this all evolves. But I'm hearing we're having to wrap up. Bruno, Christopher, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for plugging in. Thank you for sharing the great work both of your organizations are doing. It's been a pleasure. And all of that, I wish you both the very best.
Thanks so much. Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care, guys. Take care. Okay, we're going to keep moving, and we have another 15-minute presentation with another of our event partners, Earth Up, talking on the topic of Scope 4 and how involving your employee magnifies corporate impact. And leading this presentation, we have Stephen Bay, CEO at Earth Up, and Derek Six, Chief Business Officer at Climeco. Over to you, Stephen.